Wow. I have been changed for good. Some of you were here perhaps when we heard this song in worship before. We chose it for a new member welcome Sunday about a year and a half ago, I think. Some of you who plan worship know that when we repeat a song so soon, it's usually for a reason. The song comes from the musical Wicked. It's a retelling of the story of the Wizard of Oz, in which the hero is really the Wicked Witch of the West. She's green, and her name is Elphaba. And I think in that sermon I also mentioned I had the chance in college to come out in an apartment shared by one woman who went on to play Elphaba, the Leslie part, on Broadway, and another woman who went on to play the same role in the first national tour of Wicked many years after she was on the Broadway company in other roles. So my point in that sermon was not a lot of people get to come out to two musical theater superstars at the same time, much less two different Elphabas. But just like anything, with a little bit of time, a song starts to mean more than it might have meant first. Once, actually, after an interfaith Thanksgiving meeting, Rabbi Ken next door at the Temple Emmanuel said that they were planning to have this same song in their services that weekend. And I realized it was the week leading to Yom Kippur, the time of atonement when we set right, or try to set right, the wrongs we've done in the past to those in our community. And Rabbi Ken is a great musician and is extremely smart. And so his telling me how he thinks about this song embodies atonement changed the way I now hear and understand this song. I've been changed for good, a kind of atonement. Now, atonement is a big thing in theological circles. It deals with the question many might have faced in childhood or beyond about how and why humankind was or was not saved. And the history of our tradition has something to say about that. One of the most important works in any Universalist history is a work called A Treatise on Atonement by Hosea Ballou, and published in 1805. So we're going way back, getting a little classical on us today. If any of you out there are thinking of becoming a Unitarian Universalist minister, this book will be on the test. Ballou was a Baptist minister who, like a lot of other Universalists, read the scriptures, the Christian scriptures, and found salvation in a loving God who wanted to end all suffering, not a thuggish God who watches all creation wallow in sin and pain. That's what our Calvinist cousins were doing. So in the early part of the 19th century, you got to understand, when Ballou launched this book on the world of churches and theology, it made a little bit of a stir. It formed the theological starting point for what we call American Universalism. And American Universalism and Ballou's work draws a direct line to the Unitarian Universalist movement, of which many of us are a part today, and especially this week following General Assembly. This book still influences many today in our faith who are doing the work of professing the idea of a loving universe. But friends, talking about universal salvation or universalism in 1805 in the United States was not popular, and Ballou knew it. It's not that popular today, to be honest. Here is a warning from the author himself, right from the text, A Treatise on Atonement. He says this in warning: "To profess universal salvation will subject some to excommunication from regular churches, others to the pain of being neglected by their neighbors, others to the violently opposed by their companions, and in many instances, undoubtedly, the father will be against the son, and the son against the father, the mother against the daughter, and the daughter against the mother, and a man's enemies may be those of his own house." Well, luckily we're not in any kind of regular church today, friends. But it is hard to miss the level of discord at work in this belief. He's talking about universal forgiveness and love, literally tearing households apart. And in particular, believing that there is a loving, sacrificing, atoning force in the world bent on bringing about salvific love in the lives of all, hell-bent upon it, literally. This doctrine says as clearly as any other doctrine in any other faith, be not afraid. And it means it. But after the warnings are done, Ballou's work addresses squarely the ways that a divine presence atones for the sins of others, of humans. And the thrust of the work is not to invite followers of this faith simply to sit back and enjoy all the work this divine presence does. Yeah, thanks for that, universe. I'm good now. I got this. No. Ballou's universalism called humans to look at and understand this enormous cosmic gift of freedom, this atonement, and then to model this atonement in the way we live with one another. I have been changed for good. It's no wonder our neighbors next door like to listen to that song at a time and a season of setting things right with our community. What the singers say over and over in that song isn't because I love you, I have been changed for good, or because I fear you, I have been changed for good. No, what is it? Because I knew you. Now, today, on this day, these past few weeks, these past few months, we are in days when many of us are rethinking what it is we really think we know. What we think we know about our health and our safety, for sure. What we think we know about how the perception of race has concrete, discernible impacts on people, communities, nations, and worlds. What we think we know about history. Carol carried to us the words of a sacred ancestor today, the words of Marsha P. Johnson about what it takes to be part of history. For years, for decades, for half a century, so many historians, so many white historians told the history of the gay rights movement. And like a lot of histories, it was woefully incomplete. What it left out, what it erased, what it whitewashed was the way that movement started in the hearts and the fists of people who identify as more than that word simply gay, as this half a century later calls to mind. Marsha P. Johnson was credited for years as the one who, I love this, threw the shot glass heard around the world that started the Stonewall uprising. But Marsha would be the first to tell you that it wasn't even she who threw that first glass at a cop. The shot glass was meant to be thrown on June 28, 1969, 51 years ago, when the uprising began at 1 a.m. at the Stonewall Inn, a bar that welcomed a wide range of clientele who expressed a wide range of expressions of both sexuality and gender. After police raided that establishment and began abusing the clientele, and many believed for many years that Marsha P. Johnson threw that first glass at the police, but she didn't. Marsha explained herself in an interview that she only got to the Stonewall Inn around 2 a.m., an hour after it all began. The uprising had started already, but she jumped right in when she got there. Marsha's words about history being made when people decide, when they jump in, when they make something happen, were so important because they were coming from someone who was not afraid to set the record straight, not to try to focus the spotlight on themselves, but on the truth of what really happened. And what really happened, what historian after historian will tell you today, whether people want to listen or not, is that the people that were there, who really got the uprising started, that kicked off one of the most successful liberation movements in a century, those people were beautiful black and brown people. They were trans people. They were sex workers. They were brave people. Yes, they were gay white males there too, but you want to know something? In 1969, gay white males still had a lot to lose. And many of the Stonewall clientele who identified as gay in this conventional sense were not keen to be in the spotlight. So the very first leaders were the people who lived their lives out loud, who had lost their families of origin to hostility, hatred, and misguided thinking, who had found a place to call their own in New York City's Greenwich Village, who had no more you-know-whats to give. And I'm sorry for being a little coarse here, friends, but I've been to the Stonewall Inn. I drank at the Stonewall Inn, and friends, I've been kicked out of the Stonewall Inn. So I'm going to claim a little bit of personal privilege in this moment to talk about this here. This is the thing. Inside the movement for liberation that started 51 years ago this morning, and along the march from the Stonewall Inn to Sheep's Meadow that took place 50 years ago today, nobody was asking if you were a lesbian, if you were gay, if you were bisexual, if you were trisexual or asexual. No one was asking if you were intersex, if you were questioning or queer. Nobody was asking anyone anything. They were doing the telling. They were telling the world what they wanted, liberation. From their glorious lipstick mouths and stack-heeled boots, from their gleaming leather chaps and roaring motorcycles, from these children who were set against by their parents who were enemies in their own home, came demands for liberation from the bondage of the life given to them and for the chance to embrace and live fully the life they got to choose instead. And this should not be surprising in the least, because even 20 years ago, when you go into the Stonewall Inn, or really any bar like the Stonewall Inn in the world, like Jules Catch One, nobody there is hoping to be classified as one of the letters in an alphabet or a category in the parade of identities that are seeking rights withheld for so long. Nobody there is hoping to speak for anyone else on any particular political matter. Nobody there is hoping for anything less than to be seen, to be heard, and to be known. Because I knew you, I have been changed for good. And that, my friends, if Hosea Ballou was writing today, is what he would want. It's what he would proclaim. It's what he would demand from us all. Universal salvation in this life, modeled on the kind of love that conquers death, the kind of love that marches through Manhattan regardless of consequences, the kind of love that knows the person, not the initial, not the category before them. Hosea Ballou tells us that humans, in his words, are constituted with powers of sympathy, and while these principles last, they cannot enjoy complete happiness and see one of our fellow creatures in torment. In 1805, then there were fighting words. In 1805 theology speak, Ballou is railing against any idea that preventable harm against our fellow creatures is ordained or somehow allowed by an all-powerful God. And instead, he points to the universal experience of sympathy for our fellow creatures being a sign, a sacred sign, a call to action to stop that misery, as proof that we must act in the face of such torment. As a Unitarian Universalist community, we must hold our history, this treatise on atonement, alongside every tool at our disposal to bring about the call of this cornerstone of our theology. Even the word atonement is literally a contraction from the Middle English of the words at one. When we experience atonement, we atone. The fractures or ways we might feel broken are returned and set right so that we are at one again. And friends, in our history as a faith, as a people, probably as individuals, there is so much we have to make one again, to atone for. I know, I've done it, that some of us, out of misunderstanding, fear, curiosity, simple ignorance, or just bad jokes, have missed or misunderstood the many and varied ways that our fellow creatures show and experience affection or don't, show and identify with a particular gender or don't, show and identify the ways that patriarchy, heteronormativity, and whiteness force those who want something more, something different, something outside the norm for themselves to categorize themselves in one of the ways that are accepted because it's just easier for everybody else to understand. And friends, it's not just heteronormativity. Sometimes the tools of the oppressor in the hands of the oppressed are just as sharp or sharper. It is well known, well documented, that white men who identify as gay exhibit at times clear patterns of overt racist attitudes toward people of color to a disturbing extent. And history seems sometimes to just keep repeating itself. In a powerful article last year for NBC News, George Johnson, a journalist of color, explains that, in his words, although white queer people share in our queer oppression, they are still beneficiaries of white supremacy and are not above wielding that in our safe spaces. And poignantly, he adds, while black queer people are still fighting for survival, white queer people were fighting for marriage equality. In one terrible anecdote, the article uncovered many white-owned bars in a city that hid the glassware on nights that were popular with people of color. They were worried about theft or breakage. Instead, all patrons were given plastic cups. I have a feeling Marsha P. Johnson would not approve of that. But Miss Johnson is not with us anymore, because George Johnson's prescient writing was so true. Because on July 6, 1992, she was found in the Hudson River dead. Her death was ruled a suicide, but recently the case was reopened when many accounts confirmed that Miss Johnson would not have harmed herself. And when all these witnesses were asked how they could know that, how would you possibly know that this woman of history, this woman who's been through so much, would not harm herself, they had one response. They said, because we knew her. Because I knew you, I have been changed for good. Friends, not in a million years would I hope or suggest that we should all ever just come together and be like one. It's the harmonies. It's the textures. It's the differences we know in life, in one another, showing up all together at once. And that is what makes the most beautiful things in the world, much like this beautiful collection we see on our screens before us now. Uprisings in the world are still happening at once. Uprisings are taking over entire neighborhoods, entire blocks, entire cities and states at once. And faith, a faith that claims a cornerstone of atonement theory, should take notice at once. A new treatise on atonement is being written in every street where marches dare to tread. A new treatise on atonement is being scrawled across avenues by mayors who have had enough for their people. A new treatise on atonement is being etched in a history that has long forgotten, long erased, long eradicated our black and brown fellow creatures whose suffering and torment all were warned by mind more than 2 centuries ago, if humanity ever wanted joy at all in this life. And we must write this new treatise on atonement at once, my friends, so that the shock of a shot glass heard around the world might one day, at long last, be the cup of kindness that we each share together. And so we might sing to one another like 2 old friends in an apartment, just wanting to get to know the new kid in town. That little strain we might have in our own heads now. Because I knew you, I have been changed for good. May it ever be so. Happy Stonewall Sunday. Blessed be, and amen.